Thank you, Nancy, and I think we all should thank Nancy for her leadership of One Book. Last spring, the Northwestern University President's Office, in the person of Gene Lowe, you can blame him right here, invited me, a non-native, non-expert in the American Indian, to chair the steering committee for this year's One Book One Northwestern program, which, as Nancy has said, is focused on the American Indian, the inconvenient Indian, Thomas King's book. Fortunately for me, Penelope Peterson, the Dean of CESP, recommended Research Assistant Professor Kai Orton, Inupiat, Nez Perce, Canadian American, for service on the steering committee. When I read Dr. Orton's bio, I was beyond impressed. I should explain that aging journalism professors are not known for being on the bleeding edge of change. And I think you may have heard this joke. How many journalism professors does it take to change a light bulb? Change? Dr. Orton is the consummate change agent, a computational scientist, molecular biologist, learning technologist, I always screw this up. Informatician. I don't even know what an informatician is. Dr. Orton's current research is focused on developing an interdisciplinary approach to teaching math and science, and developing programs that increase computational and science literacy, persistence, and interest in STEM and computing careers for girls and underrepresented groups. When I sought to diminish my ignorance by asking for Dr. Orton's ideas for possible one-book programming, I realized from the lengthy email she sent me that she was a Renaissance woman on a native experience, interested and knowledgeable about almost everything. I saved the email. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to list some of the topics she covered. Indigenous scholars, law, political trailblazers, indigenous STEM pioneers, indigenous activists, indigenous films, and she sent me a wonderful video about Matika Wilbur, who's a photographer is committed to going around to 567 federally recognized tribal nations, photographing people in each of the nations. And Dr. Orton volunteered to take photographs of the Native American students at Northwestern. That leads me to tonight. While I'm proud of the 50-plus programs One Book has sponsored this academic year, I know that at least another year is needed to bring to Northwestern a portion of the great Native programming suggested by Dr. Orton. Given her creative ideas, I can't wait to hear what she has to say tonight. Please join me in welcoming Kai Orton.
Thank you. Nishandaka Yuina Hapoin, Sidiona Hala, Kitaki, Kashila Hishanade, Malutakni ala Hanahita. Routine Hakalena, Trisuno Nora Hadhalaway. In the language of both of the people that I descend from, my name is Kahira Hishalates Talbear, Two Feathers. I am the descendant of very proud people of the Nimianpu Nation Bear Clan and of the Inupiat of the North Canadian borders. And I'm really honored to be able to speak to you. And I just want to open up by saying that I was really surprised when Nancy told me so many people had signed up for this. And I hope that no one in the room is really expecting a linguist or a presentation on linguistics. I chose the title because it embodies a lot of my experiences, and I had the chance to meet with Thomas King earlier this year. And if you didn't get a chance to meet him, he has a very powerful presence, and part of that is through his storytelling, but the other part of that is in his truth speaking. And so when Nancy asked me if I would be willing to give a Dittmar dinner, I thought, oh boy, I don't know if people really want to hear about computational biology. I don't know what that has to do with inconvenient Indian or anything like that. And you know, I talked to my amu because when anything happens anytime in my life, I talked to my amu, and they told her that the university that I worked at was reading a book, and it was written by a First Nations author, and she thought that was really cool. And she asked me, you know, was I going to read the book too? And I said, well, I already read it. And she said, what did you think? And I said, oh, there's some good stories, and I recounted some good stories to her. I said, you know, they asked me to talk at a dinner with lots of people. And she said, oh, well, then you have to tell them the stories. So with that, I'm just curious, did anyone try to pronounce this word? Because I'm going to hopefully have you speaking a little bit of Inupiaq before the evening's done. So Nakingakpit means, where are you from? And in all languages that you want to learn, that's probably one of the first questions you're ever asked. It's probably one of the first things you learn how to respond to. And so on your table you have index cards. And I know the tradition for Dittmar dinners, maybe you haven't been to one, is to start a discussion. And so I wanted to start this discussion by, you know, I can't ask all of you to say it in the room, but if you could just write down on the front of one of the cards your answer to that question. And then if you could put the card on the other side, we'll get to the next question. And then I'd love to hear you all try to ask this question. I tried to phonetically spell it for you. Hopefully this is helpful. Nakingak. 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 So it probably didn't take you very long, perhaps, to write where you're from, but feel free to take a couple of other seconds. Another question that often comes up whenever you're learning to immerse yourself in a culture, this is maybe the first one, if not the second one. What is your name? Kina Awi. Kina Awi. V is very soft. Kina Awi. What is your name? Technically, it translates as something like, what are you called, or who are you called by? So if you could write that answer on the other side of your card.
The question is, what are you called by?
Yeah. And it could also be, I'll give a little clue. If I were asking you, and I am asking you, Kina Awi means a little bit more than what is just your plain name, but what does your name mean? What are you called by? So I know some people have been named for parent and ancestor, some people were named for location, but so many people around the world that have come from different naming traditions. So feel free to write any expression that you feel is a truism for yourself. And then lastly, one of my favorite things when leaving the reservation and coming to school, and something that keeps happening over and over again in my experiences, which I've sort of enjoyed more anecdotally now than I did at the beginning, was this third question, which I thought was really humorous. So in order to get into college, so I could even come here and I was asked a question like this. You're probably familiar with it. What is one word that can describe you, right? And that's pronounced atikiviluktuk. Atikiviluktuk. Technically, in Inupiat, we don't have a word like that. And as I was trying to describe this to my cousins and my family as I was applying for applications, I said, you know, I have to write a whole essay on a word that I'm going to call myself that's not my name. And they said, oh, who asked that question? I said, the university. And they were like, oh, well, you better come up with something. And they came up with lots of humorous names, things that they called me while I was a child. And I said, okay, so is that a thing? And they said, oh yeah, that's Dittmar. That's a word that someone calls you, knowing that you're going to change, so they soon forget it. Maybe you can call it a pet name if you want to think about it that way. But I always loved this, because on job applications they ask, university applications they ask. Such a cool thing, right? Just give yourself a new name, and it doesn't even matter, right? But, well, unless you have to write 250 words about it, which is really hard. But if you can write down your one word, your one truism on the other card, and then if you can just put all those cards in the middle of the table, and we'll come back to that. And I'm not meaning to rush everyone. Everyone's story takes time to tell. But since we only have 20 minutes, I'll have to ask for further. So, where I'm from, if someone were to ask you the question, you would probably be a little bit surprised. And part of that is it would be a very unusual question for someone to ask. It often is meant to provoke a different sort of thinking. Perhaps that you've forgotten where you're from, or perhaps that you've forgotten your path or your ancestors. I showed this sculpture. It's by Abraham Anke Kruben. He's a local artist who's now moved down to, where is he? He's in the Prince Edward Isles now, I think. That's where his studio is. But this sculpture is called Memories in Ancient Past. And it's one of my favorite sculptures because I feel like it embodies the way Inupiats think about themselves, which is, if you look at this sculpture, you might think that's a lot of stuff. And it is. It's really a lot of stuff. In the center is the transformation of Angak, which is a shaman. And his face is hollow, which is indicative of being receptive to knowledge. But all throughout the sculpture are different transformations that have taken place. We see the presence of the eagles, bears, the whales, all of the spirit animals that give us different teachings. They're all interconnected. And on the right-hand side, you see Sedna, who's the goddess who protects all of the sea creatures. And on the right, you see a mother and child. And all of these are representative figures of all of the stories of all of the teachings that we are supposed to follow in our life. And so this sculpture sort of embodies everything. And then on the top, we have these representative figures of the drum players. These are the storytellers. This is where our knowledge comes from. This is where our ancestry is recorded. This is where we find our truth. And so when I look at this sculpture, it has really profound meaning, and I think it's really beautiful because this is carved on the skull of a bowhead whale, which has been part of our tradition to hunt, and it serves both as a source of knowledge for our traditional storytelling, but it's also a source of food and sustenance, and it's also an amazing resource in terms of the materials that it produces.
How big is it?
Bowhead whale?
No, this sculpture.
This sculpture is about from where Nancy is to the end of this projector.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It was a young whale, apparently.
Something you could drag on the beach.
Something you could drag on the beach. And so when we ask this question, if I were to ask you what would be a more fair question, would be which means where do you call home, instead of where are you from, because you come from another culture. That would be a fair question. But I want to start this discussion around this very question. Because if I really wanted to know where you were from, I could say, where were you born? But when this question is asked, where are you from, what they mean is something similar. Naki means where from, but kina means the person who you are. And so there are lots of words that start with kin to describe the essence of the person. A person who's going blind, a person who can run very fast, would all start with that root. And so if I were to answer your question, if you asked me this question, I would say I'm from Lake Athabasca area in Saskatchewan, and I would say I also grew up between there and Cambridge Bay in Nunavut. And you'd probably shake your head and you'd probably ask me the same question I've been asked a lot of my life. How did you get here? And I always like joking with that Bugs Bunny Roadrunner or Coyote answer. He says, I got lost on the way to Albuquerque. People always find that really funny. But I do that because what I've learned is that most people really don't want to hear your story. They don't really want to understand how you actually got here because it's a really long story. And when people ask you, they're standing in a hall or in an elevator. And for a moment when I first came here, I thought, oh, these people really want, they're just like people back home. They weren't. But if you were to ask me, like my Amma asked me, it hurt. It hurt in a really deep place to hear my Amma ask me that question. And I got really frustrated in graduate school because I was calling her because I was frustrated. I was calling her because I felt lost and I felt like I didn't belong. And every time someone asked me where I was from and I would tell them, they would say, whoa, you're a long way from home, or how'd you get here, or you're exceptional, or that's so unusual, or I've never seen someone like you here, you know there's no other Indians here. And I would just hear this, array of things that made me feel like I had to ask myself the question, what am I doing here? And so, I was reminded one day I was supposed to be writing an abstract, 150 words. That was really tough. And so I did what most people do, well, at least most people like me. I started cleaning my room instead of writing. And I found this stack of papers, and they were applications that I had sent to all 16 universities and colleges that I had applied to, with all of my SAT and SAT forms and everything else that I had. And I realized that I had paid something like $786 for where I was right at that moment. And that I had filled out, typed out, and submitted electronically so many different forms. And then I thought, well, okay, I have no excuse. And so when my Amu asked me that question, she was really talking about the story of Kisina Nimchuka. And what that means is you're never alone. You always have your ancestors with you. And so why do you feel lost? Why do you feel like you don't belong? And, I still struggled with that because I was like, you only say that because you're on the reservation, you have everybody else there, and I'm here all by myself. And I was this really frantic adult who felt more like a child. And that was hard. And so, the thing that if you were to ask me this, I would say, and this is what I said to my Amu, I'm Nemiapu, I'm Inupiat. I know where I'm from. And she just shook her head over Skype, and the most annoying thing in the world is your Amu over Skype, Because you think, you're calling her because you love her, and she's just going to be like your Amu, right? But the thing is, she's your Amu. She's just over Skype. So you don't get the food, and you don't get the smells, and you don't get the hug. You just get this, thing, this box with her face in it, and her talking, and you're just wondering, is this phone call going to end? Because you're not getting what you want. And that was also a moment when I realized I was not acting like an Inupiat child. I was acting like people that I was around. I was frustrated. I wanted a quick answer. And in my frustration one day, I said, Amo, you keep saying, you know, the reason that I'm like this is because I lost the language. Why do you keep saying, I was like, I'm trying to tell you what's happening to me, and we don't have these words. We don't have these words in our language. And there it all happened. In my moment of darkness and complete and utter lostness, because that's a new word for me too, I realized something really important, and that was that what she was saying was, I lost my way. The answer she wanted was me to remember that I am the descendant of my namesake. This is my Amu, and this is my Appa. And so when people ask you where you're from, they want to know, yeah, what nation? But they also want to know who your ancestors were. They also want to know your family. And this is my Amu now. You know, this picture is one of my favorite pictures, and it's so sad that you can't see the true brilliance. I'll show you the likeness afterwards when it's not so pink and horrid. But the newspaper came to take a picture of my Appa when he turned 107. And my Ama refused to get up, so she's in this picture, and it's one of my favorite. And then afterwards, when they sent us the proof, they sent us a picture of the article, she was so mad, she said, they took my picture. And I was like, oh, you wouldn't get up. And she said, now everybody can see I don't have teeth. And I was like, oh, goodness. I was like, well, you know, I told you we can go get some teeth. So now we have teeth for her. She smiles a lot more, but she won't pose for any pictures. So I still have some of her, which I'd be happy to share. But they're also asking the question about the rest of your family. And so when you tell your story, it's the collective inheritance. It's much like that sculpture. My Amu was a holy woman. She was an Okpik. And the Okpik is a special type of healing medicine practice that's known only to women. And so she is my ancestor. I understood a lot of what I know about medicine through her. These are her two sisters. That's my Amu on the left. So when we ask this question too, I wouldn't actually tell you Cambridge Bay, and I wouldn't even say like Athabasca. I would tell you I'm from Iqaluktutiak, because that's what we call it. And Iqaluk means fish, and Iqaluktutiak means good place for fishing. I would also tell you I'm from Boyat Iwetam, which is the Niniapu word for the far side of the lake, instead of Fond du Lac. But I might say Fond du Lac because you might know French. And so that's all part of my ancestry too. But the other thing people might wonder is, how did the Niniapu even get to northern Canada? If you know anything about the Niniapu, they're supposed to be in Idaho. And that's where my inheritance also begins. In about 1873, my family left their homelands for the first time because they were being pursued by the U.S. Army in an attempt to put them on reservation land. And it's a pretty sad story, but by 1875, they had been chased all the way across this map, which you can barely see the red trail, avoiding being captured and being put on a reservation. I was born 100 years later. My family sought refuge with the Cree Indians, but they were turned away. They weren't able to be helped. And so they escaped to Canada with the Lakota, and they were helped by Chief Sitting Bull. And my family, my grandmother, was one of the women and children that actually went up through Canada. They only went back one other time, and that was to go collect medicine from the homelands, and they went right back to Canada. And there's a lot of broken trust between First Nations and American Indians and the U.S. government, so much so that you actually have a lot of First Nations on their reservations with a lot of Native American tribes. So Canadian Indigenous people refer to themselves as First Nations, American Indians refer to themselves as American Indians. But it's not like you think where you would have this separation. That's not the way that the people were. And, you know, in my trials in graduate school, every time I talked to Mamo, she would remind me of our family's plight, of our passage, and how we made it to Canada, and how it's not that I didn't belong where I was. You know, like we were never allowed to be in any singular place, and so why should I feel out of place? So when I ask you the questions, we're going to get there. I first have to answer the second question for you, which is my name. My name was one of my favorite things to learn about when I was little until I heard the whole story, and then it was really sad. I didn't want my name anymore. I was so happy to be named for my amo. And so the story is about the Medvik and the Kaina. So my amo and I were both born twins. My twin didn't survive, but in Inupiat traditions, your twin is always acknowledged. You're always acknowledged as a twin. And so your story is always that you have a part of your other self somewhere. And so Pilea and Kotu, how many of you raise your hands if you've heard about the Great Spirit? Okay. So for those of you who are not familiar with the Great Spirit, many First Nations and Native American people, they were converted into Christianity, but the first teachings were that the Great Spirit, which is the Creator, Nana, which is the earth, was already born. And the Great Spirit loved Nana so much that he sang a song, and his voice was so deep, it sounded like a water drum. And into that song, he sung into existence his first daughter and son, who were Pilea and Kotu, twin eagles. Pilea's wings were white and huge, and she was very powerful, and she had the protective instincts of the mother. And Kotu was very strong, and his wings were even stronger. And the two eagles were given a gift, the Kaina. And this was described as this great block of ice, and within this block of ice were all of the seeds, all of the stories, all of the medicines, everything that was ever going to come to be. And the eagles flew the gift down to Nana. And as the water began to melt from the Kaina, Kotu began to flap his wings so hard. And he became the wind. And all of everything went everywhere. His wings shaped the mountains and created river currents by pushing the water into Nana. And this is the story that I was told when I was little. And I said, oh, I'm Pilea. And that was what they called me for a long time. And I said, but the rest of my name, what is the rest of my name? And then my amo told me that my name was both the story of the Kaina, the story of Pilea, the story of the gift, and the one teaching of the Great Spirit, which is that all of it has to be returned in order to remain. And so I learned that day, when I was 6 years old, that my name meant the one who carries the gifts that have to be returned. And you want to talk about the anger of a 6-year-old child? I thought about all the visits into town when I had ice cream, and all of my red glass marbles, and how I was supposed to have to give them back, and I didn't even know where they came from. I thought about everything that I'd ever done, and I felt sort of sad that they were just telling me now, and that I was behind schedule. And then I also thought, well, who am I supposed to give all this stuff to? I don't need, some of this stuff, I got it, the people are dead, and that was my justification for keeping something. And my mama laughed so hard, and she said, oh, you have the rest of your life to do this. And that's a really heavy thing to tell a 6-year-old. And I knew that. I knew that at the time. I knew that I was supposed to be doing a lot of stuff. And I also knew that I didn't know how. And so I said, well, how am I supposed to do that? And she said, learn the words and listen to the stories. You'll be fine. That's what grandmothers all tell you, be fine. So that's the story of my name. I never get a chance to tell that story, and the reason that I don't is because I go by Kai. And there's a story with that too. When I was 19 years old and enrolled in university, I went to open my account with the bank, and there was like a fraud notice that came up, and they said, you can't open your account. And I said, well, I need an account to get my electric turned on at my apartment. And, I have this lease, and what do you mean you can't open my account? And they said, well, we have a fraud alert. You have to call the credit bureau. I said, okay, call the credit bureau, and they said, there are 28 different aliases on your credit report. And I thought, well, that's interesting, because I just got here. All I had done was applied for school, applied to take the SAT, I had applied for leases, I had done this stuff with school. Well, it turned out my real name, which is 17 letters long, people had tried to shove it into these different forms. And so even my passport, they had split my name into two parts and given me a middle name that wasn't my middle name. It was like my whole name. And so I ended up having to go to a judge because I was like, I have to fix this. This is going to be a real problem, because everyone said, if you don't have credit, you have nothing, right? So I was like, well, that's important. So I went to this judge, and as I stood there with my forms and my $85 to change my name, I had my check in hand, my cashier's check, I had done all this work, I was standing there with my form, and I thought, surely this is not going to be a problem. And the judge resumed to lecturing me about all of the reasons that anyone would ever have to be able to change their name. He told me about people needing witness protection. He told me about new families adopting kids and how they needed new identities and they needed to feel comfortable. He told me about people getting married. He told me about people getting divorced. And then he asked me with a really strong, bold voice whether or not I had any of those reasons, any of those justifications, and I thought, well, no. And he said, well, what's your story then? And I said, well, legally I've been living with aliases anyway, so I guess I'm not legally here in the first place. And I can't get a passport until you change my name because it won't fit in the U.S. passport system. And he looked at me sort of bewildered for a moment, and he looked around at the clerks, and he said, is that true? And I said, yeah, it only accepts 15 letters. I can't legally use my name on anything U.S. And he said, you have to come back after lunch. So I just sat around waiting, and I came back after lunch, and apparently the clerk looked it up and confirmed that, in fact, I couldn't do anything legally. And so without further word, he took my $85 check, and he stamped it, and he said, I learned something today. And I got to walk out of that courtroom, but I thought, man, that was easy. Like, he didn't even give me a guilt trip about not using Kile instead of Kai. He didn't have anything to say about any of this other stuff. And right then and there, my name was chopped down from 17 letters to 3. And, I picked it because it was the only part of my name I thought people could pronounce. But when I told my amo, she cried. And I cried. And I felt like such a bad kid. And I thought, but I have to go to college. I need electric. I need all this stuff. I need some credit cards. I can't get that. And I felt really conflicted the whole time I was in graduate school because it felt like everything that I was doing to conform and to fit into one place, I was doing a terrible thing in the other. So that's the story of my name. So, and I don't have all sad stories. I don't. I'm just kind of a sad person when it comes to talking about my family, only because I love them so much and I'm so far from home. But what I want to share is that words are stories. I don't know a single Inupiat word or Namiapu word that doesn't have a story or some sort of meaning. And every time you ask your ama something and she says you forgot the words, you shouldn't think that she's like accusing you of like forgetting the language. She knows you know it because she reminds you of it every single time she talks to you every week on Skype. What she means is that the words are the stories. And if you forgot the stories, you can't possibly bring the power of your ancestors and your heritage into your life. So I want to share with you some other fun anecdotes. So me and my family, through talking a lot and learning from each other, we figured out a couple of things, that there are the right words. So in graduate school, one of my real struggles was with being concise. Maybe you understand why, but hold your laughter for just a moment. So as a graduate student, my PI was really sort of a tyrant, and he wanted you to get to the point really fast. He wanted your abstract, if like the organization said 150 words, he wanted 100. and he wouldn't accept 101. You know, he was that sort of guy. And, you know, I was really upset one day because I had given this group meeting where you're supposed to present your data and talk about all your findings, and it's supposed to be this great thing where you get feedback and validation, you feel really good about yourself. And my group meeting went terribly wrong. I had prepared like 30 slides, and I got to like the 5th slide. And people were still like wanting me to go back to slide 3. And, you know, I was just like, I was distraught afterwards, and I thought, like, no one even knows what I've been working on the last 6 months. And the next time I'm going to have to talk about this is like a year from now. And so I called my amo, because that's what you do when you're distressed. And she was like, you know, why are you still in this place? You always sound unhappy. And I said, I'm not unhappy, I'm frustrated, you know, in my language. And she said, why are you frustrated? And I said, you know, because I don't understand how to be concise. And she said, what does that mean? I tried to explain what that meant. And I said, you know, and so in several rounds, she's like, this doesn't make sense. And I was like, you know, it means like when you like use less words, or you like get to the point really fast. And she said, oh, I don't know that, you know, I don't know that that's a thing. And I was like, oh, I think it's a thing. You know, I was like, here it's a thing. And she was like, you know, we don't do that. And I was like, yeah, I know that. And I was like, but I was like, maybe someone does. Like, and she said, you just don't know the word. I think if you knew the word, I would know what you're talking about. And I was like, there isn't a word for this. So we kept doing this thing that we do constantly. And then the next week I talked to her, and she said, oh, I think I know what your problem is. You forgot about Tilikchik. You want to say it? Tilikchik. Tilikchik is a serpent. So the story of Tilikchik is a really funny one. So this is a painting by an Anishinaabe artist depicting this story. But Tilikchik is a serpent, and he has a big head and a long tail, really short legs. So one day there was a young boy, and he heard that there was really good caribou hunting on the other side of the lake. And so he went out, he set out to go to the other side of the lake, but when he got to the water, he noticed that his kayak had a hole in it. And he was upset, and he looked around, and there was no one else around, and he thought, I'm going to have to walk. I'm going to have to walk all the way around the lake, and by the time I get there, the caribou are going to be gone. And he saw Tilikchik off in the brushes, kind of like slinking low, the way he always is. And he said, hey, I see you everywhere. You know how to get around. What's the fastest way to get across this lake if I don't have a kayak? And Tilikchik answered, and he said, what? So he went closer, and he kept answering, but he just couldn't hear. So he bent down really low, and Tilikchik bit his head off. My mama told me this story, and I was like, that's the worst translation I've ever heard. And she said, if you want the fast way. And I knew exactly what she meant. And I thought, yeah, that's what my advisor wants. That's exactly what he wants. You know, he keeps telling me to get to the point, but then he wants me to do all this work. And if I really want to do the right thing, you know, you don't take the shortcuts. You do it the right way. And you take the time to explain. So that was one of the first words. The next experience that I had in developing a common language with my amo was coffee to go. How many of you do coffee to go? Okay, so the word for this is kupiak-tuktuk. Okay? And kupiak-tuktuk is, I love this picture. I found this historical picture. I saw it in a museum. There's this Inupiat family, and just at their feet is this coffee pot. And you know, the first time I saw that, because they had the notation, this was taken in 1907, and I thought, what the heck? How do they get coffee? Like, you know, I mean, I grew up with coffee, but I mean, it's in the I was born in 1975, what do I know? turns out coffee like made its presence in North America in like the 1700s, so we've had it for a while. But the story that I want to tell is I live in Lincoln Park, which for better, for worse, is just where I live. And you know, one of my favorite things to do, there's a Starbucks 2 blocks away from my house, and I love going to Starbucks. And I had like my birthday certificate, which means you can get any drink for free. So of course I order like the largest thing they have with the most stuff that they can put in it. So I had my venti, double stuff, peppermint, mocha, coconut latte, thingamabob. And I was walking down the street, down to Versi, and as I'm nearing the train station, I'm only like 2 blocks away, and there is this immaculate girl. And she has on white boots with like fur lining and white pants and a white jacket and fur trimmed with white mittens. I mean, she looks like, you know, amazing. She looks like something off of like the Arctic runway. And I have my cup, and as I'm walking towards her, I'm about to compliment her, and I slip on this ice. And in trying to catch my balance, I squeezed my cup. The coffee went everywhere. And I didn't fall, which I was relieved by. But as I was turning to say my apologies, and I was very sorry because she did look spectacular, she was yelling at me, and I couldn't really understand what she was saying, but I knew she was really mad, and I thought, oh God, I got it on her clothes. And as I was trying to get my bearings, I realized I had. And then she said, who walks around with a paper cup anyway? You need to get a proper recyclable cup. And I thought, and then I thought, is that why they sell those things there? Like, they're like $20. Is that, oh, and then I was like, what do you get to-go cups for then anyway? Like, if you're supposed to buy these expensive things? And I spent the next 2 blocks and then waiting for the train really confused as to what just happened. And that I had been chastised for not having this plastic, recyclable, reusable mug thing. And so that evening, you know, so that day I told a couple people, you know, that I work with, and they laughed at this story. And they thought, like, you're so mean. They would say, like, you're so mean. I was like, I didn't do it on purpose. You know, and so I thought, like, wow, I don't get any empathy from them that I got yelled at for not having this $20 mug. And so I thought my mama would understand, and I told her the story. Before I even finished the story, she said, wait, why were you walking around outside with coffee? And I said, no, I was like, I had it to go. And I was trying to explain, like, you know, I had this temporary, a paper cup. I had it in a paper cup. And she said, why did you have the coffee in a paper cup? And I was like, because I was going to the train. I just got it to go to the train. And she said, you know, I couldn't even get to spilling it all over the girl. Right? She's like, why are you walking around with hot coffee? And I was like, why aren't you listening to the rest of my story? And she said, why are you walking around with coffee? Where is this paper? Why are you walking around with the paper cup? I thought, wow, she is siding with that crazy girl. And you know, as I was talking to her, I thought, yeah, I guess no one's going to do that back home because we don't have to-go coffee. And everybody who drinks coffee, because it's like a special treat, you drink it with your family and your friends. It's sort of ceremonial. Like, you wouldn't be walking around with coffee in a paper cup. And I just thought, wow, I'm really lost here. Like, why am I walking around? Why am I ever walking around with coffee? Why am I not being civilized and like drinking it at home? You know, why am I walking on the train and like touching things with it? You know, I did this whole like dissecting of like, what am I doing? And, you know, she came up with this word, this kupiakituchak, which means to drink coffee the wrong way. To describe the whole experience of to-go coffee. And, you know, and I thought she would not invest in Starbucks. And then my last story is dog sledding. So you would think, being Inupiaq, that I would be somewhat of an expert on dog sledding, that we would have words for it. Yeah. And we do. Except I had a different experience. right around my third year of grad school, I had gone home, and we raised dogs. And so we had a litter, and there was a runt. And she was very small. And they were going to cull her. And for those of you who don't know what it means, I'm not going to tell you that it's kind of bad. So they were going to cull her, and I decided I'm going to bring her back with me. I could have a dog in my apartment. I decided it was the right thing to do. I brought her home. And she did turn out being much smaller than she should have been. And I got really excited because, she was my companion in the wilderness. She spoke Inupiat. So we talked a lot every day. And we had lots of conversations about who she was going to grow up to be in the city as a Nunavut dog. And I got really excited when I had been having these great experiences with Chicago Meetup. Has anyone tried the Chicago Meetup thing? Okay. You can meet up with people for anything in the world. And apparently there's a greater Chicago area dog sledding meetup. And I was super duper excited. And I signed up, and there were like 64 other people, and I thought, holy cow, all these people with sled dogs, this is going to be the best experience of my life. I drove out to this forest preserve somewhere northwest suburbs, like past Niles and everything. And, in the distance I could see this hill, and as I pulled into the parking lot, I could hear a lot of dogs barking, and I thought, oh, this is going to be great. And as I passed through the clearing of the trees, I saw people sliding down the hill with their dog on the sled. So good. And I didn't even know what to do. And as I stood there stunned, a really nice man came up to me and he said, I haven't met you before. I haven't seen you here before. My name's Mark. And I just sort of did this. And he said, pretty overwhelming, right? Isn't this great? And he was just so friendly. And he said, you didn't bring a sled. And, I was just sort of like, no, I didn't. And he said, that's okay. I can break her in. And I thought, you're going to break my dog into what? He walked my dog all the way up the hill, and I was sort of a zombie. I walked up there with him, and he said, do you want to try first? And I had no idea what he was even talking about, so I was just, no, you could go right ahead. He sat on the sled, and he coaxed my little dog to sit in front of him. And she did, because she's like sort of dumb and friendly like that. And she was so excited. She wanted to go over and over again. And by the end of the day, I had gone down that hill several times with her. But when I got home, I had a moment of reckoning. Because I had a Skype date with my amo the next morning, and I had no idea how I was going to explain how I, coming from a family that raises dogs, that I had taken my dog sledding. And, she came up with this word, usumiak tak tak, which means the dog has the whip. So I tell you these stories because a lot of my graduate experience was really challenging, and I found humor and beauty and lightness in talking to my amo and discovering that a lot of the words that we didn't have, one, made them laugh wildly, and these are things that they now use to describe the ridiculousness of my life. I have a hard time telling them that I'm respected and that people invite me to give talks. Because all they hear are these stories of me walking around with hot coffee and sledding with dogs, and I have a lot of other stories that they just really, they're probably very surreal to them. And to me, it's equally surreal that when I go home, I realize how much of myself feels foreign. And I've had so many moments where I felt like I was an imposter. That I was an imposter both to my people when I was here, and when I was there, I was an imposter for all of my pursuits. And I felt always conflicted, but it was this experience of actually including my elders in my experience and finding the words to describe these things that historically have never happened to my people. And I want to leave you with one parting word, and this is actually one of the longer words in the Inupiat lexicon. It's Nirak Aliganirak Itak, which means wherever your path starts, wherever you begin. And it's this idea. I wear this symbol. This is incidentally. This is also the design for how you would make an igloo. This represents the sacred path, and so most of the things that Inupiats build, most of the things that we practice are centered around this symbology, and that is that there's this constancy, but there's also this oneness. And so the idea that your path starts wherever you're standing is a really forgiving one. And so for me, as a graduate student, as a woman, as a daughter, I wear this constantly, and on the other side is Ilatak, which is he's the trickster that will keep people, when you wear it the other way, he keeps other people away who might distract you from your path. And so, she would always wish me this every time I talked to her, that I would stay on my path and that I would remain true. And despite the fact that I always feel like I'm an imposter, in every world that I feel like I find myself, I try to remember the words and to remember that the words are our stories, and it's helped me to resolve a lot of my own identity. And while I've told you a lot of really northern Canadian humor, I feel like this is sort of a universal thing. Like you have your stories too. And so for the rest of the time, I really wanted, for us to go back to the cards and your answers, and in light of everything that I've told you, and I actually wanted my amo to get on Skype, but it turns out that they're getting snow squalls, so the connectivity wouldn't work. But I wanted to thank you, Ayappak and Eshchikiweo. Thank you for being my audience, for hearing stories, for laughing, because sometimes people don't get how funny I am. I think at this point I'm supposed to let you take control of the sled, right?
Yes. So we do have questions, and so all of you, so this is the part where you're all supposed to talk to each other, and this is a guide for you to have those conversations, and maybe you can actually have something to eat, which would be really nice for you, I would say.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pass it around. If somebody just wants to take charge of your table, would you like to be the table leader?
Okay.
Or to assign the table leader? Do you want to be the table leader to guide the discussion?
Sure.
Sorry.